Hello and thank you for joining us. I'm Wilson Stribling. Welcome to another edition of At Issue, where we discuss and debate the issues facing the state of Mississippi and how these issues impact you. It's the 11th week of the 2019 Mississippi legislative session, and lawmakers are giving bills final passage or sending them to conference for more work. Let's take a look at the status of some of the most discussed and debated issues this session. Senate Bill 2116 has been signed into law, giving Mississippi one of the nation's most restrictive abortion laws. The measure would ban most abortions once a fetal heartbeat can be detected or about 6 weeks into pregnancy. The Center for Reproductive Rights calls the bill blatantly unconstitutional and says it will sue Mississippi to try to block the bill from becoming law on July 1st. Governor Bryant says he is not concerned about lawsuits.
Every year we are haunted by the hundreds of thousands of babies that are murdered across this nation. We should all take to the streets and protest every time an innocent life is taken in this nation, and we seem somehow to shrug our shoulders and expect that it's going to go on without challenge. We in the pro-life community are going to challenge it each and every day, every opportunity we get. These organizations that are threatening the governor of the state of Mississippi, the people of the state of Mississippi, the House and Senate threatening to file a legal action. And so if that's what they choose to do, then we will decide and we'll choose to defend this law in a court. And so the struggle will begin.
Another measure headed to the governor's desk is Senate Bill 2901, known as the Landowner Protection Act. The Senate voted 31-21, agreeing with changes the House made on a bill that would make it harder for people to sue Mississippi property owners for some injuries occurring on their land. It says a person who owns, leases, operates, or manages property could not be held liable for injuries caused by a third party unless there's proof that the person in charge knew about possible harm and let it happen. The bill's opponents believe it will be almost impossible to hold property owners accountable.
A trial lawyer I know, who is a super trial lawyer, says that these are the toughest cases to win, cost exorbitant amounts of money to advance, the law is well settled, and if the case doesn't have any merit, it's weeded out by the Supreme Court. So why do we need this bill? Oh, I forgot. So that businesses don't have any liability when we dine at their restaurants, shop at their businesses, or stay overnight at their hotels.
The Senate voted 32-17 to adopt a resolution calling for a convention of the states, despite a rally outside the chamber. Senate concurrent resolution number 596 would allow a commission selected by the legislature to join other states in discussing amendments to the U.S. Constitution that would limit how much money the state receives from the federal government, limit the federal government's powers, and impose term limits on Congress. Opponents say they're worried the convention would open the door to other constitutional changes being considered.
The Constitution abolished slavery. The Constitution gave the right to vote. The Constitution gave women the right to vote. The Constitution guarantees due process. For us at a moment like now to vote for a bill that will give a limited few the authority to change the Constitution is backwards.
In a state like Mississippi that relies predominantly on federal funding for everything from education to child care to health care, we are the state who receives more money than any other state back from the federal government. If anybody should be concerned about a balanced federal budget, it should be states like New York and New Jersey.
A constitutional convention would at a minimum deepen the political divide and put at risk our civil rights and civil liberties, and at worst, the entire Constitution could be up for revision.
The proposal now heads to the House for more discussion. Lawmakers gave final passage to a bill to make schools safer for children. The House and Senate voted to send bills concerning a teacher pay increase, criminal justice reform, and human trafficking to conference for more work. Final amendments to and passage of these bills and others face a later deadline. A lottery board member and a state senator are facing questions about an $80,000 fundraiser. In a Senate Finance Committee meeting, some senators questioned whether there's a conflict of interest interest between Lottery Board nominee Gerard Gibert and Republican Senator Michael Watson of Hurley. Watson is running for Secretary of State. He is also on the Finance Committee, which confirms the Lottery Board members. MPB's Desiree Frazier has more.
Mississippi lawmakers on the Senate Finance Committee are in the midst of confirming the governor's nominees for the state's Lottery Corporation Board of Directors. The board will create the lottery and oversee it. Senator Barbara Blackman is talking to nominee Gerard Gibert.
I could still judge fairly, but the appearance is what is coming into question.
The Democrat from Canton is questioning Gibert about a fundraiser he recently held at his home for Republican Senator Mike Watson of Hurley. Watson is running for Secretary of State. He's also on the Finance Committee, which is discussing confirming the 5-member lottery board. Blackman's concerned about the appearance of a conflict of interest in confirming Gibert. Here's what Gibert said in the hearing.
As far as I know, we didn't violate anything. I certainly did, and I think I'm within my First Amendment rights there.
And
so.
again, I'm not trying to cast.
Oh, the appearance.
shadow
I understand the appearance point.
But I guess this is addressed to the chair, and for those individuals who did attend, would it not be in the best interest of this committee, for the integrity of this committee, and for this nominee going forward, that those individuals would recuse themselves?
Gibert, a successful businessman who founded an IT firm called Venture Technology, says he offered to have the fundraiser about 3 months before the legislature voted to create the lottery. Watson says he invited Governor Phil Bryant, who supports his campaign, and Republican members of the Finance Committee. Watson became emotional defending himself.
There are few votes that I've cast in 12 years that I'm more sure of than the one that I will cast in a couple of minutes here. I've got to answer to God for my service. And if I felt for 1 second that I was letting anybody in this building down, my wife, my children, or God, I'd recuse myself in a heartbeat. But I'm not. I've done nothing wrong. Mr. Gibert's done nothing wrong, but offer himself for service to the state.
The committee voted to confirm Gibert and 3 other nominees. They have 1 more to consider before the full Senate votes on the recommendations. Desiree Frazier, MPB News.
Thank you, Mr. Gibert. We appreciate your service and being here today.
3 African-American residents sued the state in July, saying the mapping of District 22 violates the Voting Rights Act. The district stretches through parts of 6 counties, including poor and mostly black parts of the Delta and into the more affluent and mostly white Jackson suburbs of Madison County. Republican Buck Clark of Hollandale says his Senate district has a 51% black voting age population. He was first elected in 2003. Clark is not seeking re-election this year because he's running for state treasurer, but he says he's disappointed with the federal court ruling to redraw his district.
Next year there's going to be a census. All the districts are going to be redrawn year after next by the legislature. And so it is just so odd that they would wait here right before you're going to do it anyway and expend money and time on something like that. I've won the district every 4 times, and I usually got 55% of the vote. They went back and looked at the last time Barack Obama ran in, and they looked at my district. He won my district. He and I got the same votes. I think Mike Espy got the same votes. So to say African American can't win that district, I think that's really false. It's been proven that they did.
The 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with federal Judge Carlton Reeves, who ruled the district was drawn to give black voters less than equal opportunity to elect someone reflective of themselves. The current district lines were set in 2012 and have been used since the 2015 legislative elections. Remapping District 22 will require at least 1 nearby Senate district to be redrawn as well. The appeals court set an April 3rd deadline for lawmakers to draw the new districts. Democratic Senator David Blunt of Jackson wants legislators to comply with the court order.
A number of plaintiffs sued the state of Mississippi, argued that Senate District 22 is an unconstitutional dilution of minority voting strength, and the federal court agreed with that argument. The federal court has said, yes, this district is unconstitutionally gerrymandered, for lack of a better word, and so the choices now are the legislature can either redraw that district or the court will redraw it if the legislature fails to act. And I think we ought to do it. We, the legislature, ought to do it. We have a problem. The court has made a ruling, so I think we ought to address it, fix it in the court case, and address the changes that need to be made.
So let's get straight to the point now with views from both sides of the aisle. Brandon Jones is a Democrat. He is an attorney and a former member of the House. Filling in for Austin Barber this week is Joe Nosif, former Mississippi Republican Party chairman and an attorney with the Watkins & Eager law firm in Jackson. Gentlemen, and Joe, thank you for filling in this week.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you for having me.
Let's start with this District 22 redrawing. What's the process that we undertake here, Joe?
Well, first of all, it's my understanding that the court found that the results of the drawing of the district was unconstitutional, not the intent behind it. So I believe what they found was that they didn't think an African American candidate could win, as opposed to that it was drawn with the intent to discriminate. For just to make that point, I believe that what I understand the process is if the legislature redraws it by April 3rd, which, as we were discussing, I believe requires a 2/3 vote of both houses, not the governor's signature, then there'll be the qualified deadline of April 12th. And there'll be a new election. And I think one thing that's interesting is there'll be kind of a reset button on the challenge, or if there is another challenge. In other words, that redrawn district, the extent to which it's redrawn, won't have to be submitted to the courts, my understanding, for approval. It'll just be a new election, new qualifying deadline, and then if somebody believes it's unfair, they could potentially challenge that.
Yeah, I think Joe's got the procedure right. I mean, it's a fast turnaround. April 3, complete the district. Folks are going to have to get out a map, figure out where they live, and then you got a deadline, a very short time from that. I'm sure there are members over there in some of those surrounding districts that will be watching this closely because it, as was stated, could have an impact on their race too.
And constitutional or not, it's a challenging district, quite frankly, to figure out where you are anyway.
It is, yeah, very much.
And the whole thing was brought up by 3 people who filed a lawsuit. Might this lead to other lawsuits in other districts when people realize that the process can work like this?
Potentially, but I think this is one of those very unique Senate districts. I think there are 2 that look like this one. And if you ever get out a map and you have a chance to kind of look at it, this thing goes all the way from Hollandale down about 110 miles into Gluckstadt. And it's just a very narrow, long district. And I think part of what you heard Judge Reeves say is the expectation in these situations is that it's kind of a community, that whenever people vote, you hope you're voting for someone that's kind of part of a uniform community. I don't think Gluckstadt and Hollandale consider themselves to be close.
Hollandale and Annandale.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
That's right. Those are not really the,
Well, let's move on to this to the lottery board. This is a new board, new people, a new topic that we're going to be hearing a lot about in the coming years. Will it be more political, perhaps, than people realized it might be?
Well, we're off to an interesting start. I mean, the initial conversation, we're talking about one of the new members who's hosted a fundraiser. This kind of stuff is probably far more incestuous than viewers at home want to think about. I mean, there's only a few hundred folks doing politics in Mississippi a lot of times, and a lot of times they wind up at fundraisers together. I think what I noticed just in that snip, Joe, was that what Barbara Blackman was suggesting was it might not have broken the law, but the appearance is what we want to be careful for. Because we all know that lottery committees tend to have a fairly interesting history in other states. And they sometimes have been those boards that have crossed the line. I think of the New Jersey State Commission.
Yeah.
So the notion that you would want to avoid the look of impropriety is an important one. And I know Senator Watson well. He and I went to high school together. I have no doubt that he was sincere in terms of defending his own honor in that situation. But I think they all sort of missed the point. The point is, when you do a board like this, let's just go out of our way to not have anything that would give any third party the sniff of something going weird. And that's kind of what I thought the conversation should have been about. Looks like they took it a different way, I guess.
No, I understand. And look, I think you're right. I think the palace intrigue of who's voting for what a lot of times is more interesting to those of us who are kind of in the middle of it than it is to normal people. I will say this, if you step back and kind of look at it, I haven't heard anybody say Gerard is not qualified or Michael is doing anything or would do anything unethical. Now, I know that that's different from the perception, but I kind of agree with, I think, Brandon, where you were going to begin with, which is, man, if you had this kind of standard, but you rarely might have any legislators voting on anything, because you got lots of fundraisers, you got lots of people that support people, and I think it's just a balance. And in this particular case, my belief is you could still have Michael voting and not put the integrity of the lottery board in question.
Let's talk about the abortion bill. We've said it numerous times that it's the most restrictive abortion law in the country. We said that last year when the last piece of legislation was passed. It's still being challenged in court because it was so restrictive. So, Joe, from a I guess a strategic standpoint or a political standpoint, why before the last restrictive law got passed, it's still tied up in the courts, why would you then pass another one that's even more restrictive when this hasn't even been resolved yet? What's the method behind that?
That's a great question, Wilson, and I think the answer is because it's neither strategic nor political. I think it's a policy issue. I said earlier, I think there are three groups of people with pro-life, with abortion: people that genuinely agree that it's are pro-life, genuinely pro-choice, and people who want to use it for political advantage. I think Phil Bryant, no matter what, I think he's one of the greatest people I've ever known. But even if people that don't like Phil or what he's done have to understand and realize that he's a sincere person who genuinely believes in the pro-life issue. And so I think the way they were looking at it was, I think people were so troubled by some of the language and discussion in Virginia and even in New York nationally about the practicalities of abortion, and it's a very tough issue, that I think that and the desire to try to maybe craft something different that wouldn't be potentially, if it's subject to a lawsuit, wouldn't lose. I think that was the benefit. I think that was the impetus behind it. Now, I just will say this, I don't think the fact that something might be subject to a lawsuit should be a reason, not to do it. I think if somebody feels like they're doing the right thing, they ought to do it regardless, and I really think that's what's going on in this case.
If anybody doubted that Joe was a real pro, the fact that he said sincere and non-political, I think, and held on to it, that's good. No, look, I think that I will agree with Joe insofar as I do think that this is a true priority for Governor Bryant. And I do believe that Senator Angela Hill is truly sincere when she talks about this issue, and of course she championed it in the Senate. But I do think it's worth mentioning that there are folks who believe that keeping abortion in the conversation, in the political dialogue, is favorable to Republicans, and they're not wrong about that. I mean, that's just a fact. It's favorable in a state like Mississippi, and it's a nice thing to roll out to kind of stoke the base, get people fired up, particularly in an election year. So I think that there's an element of that. It may not be by the individuals who are involved in this particular bill, but I think that it's just one of those known political truisms that when you can get that thing going, it does have a certain effect. And of course, there are districts where that might cut the other way. But in Mississippi, it's really been effective for Republicans. And so I think there's just a little bit of that we think about during an election year.
Brandon, what do we know about where we are with the budget process right now?
I had hoped that in this election year that we might go out on a little bit better note. I've been critical in the past about the secrecy over there at that Capitol building. The rank and file member not having access to some of the bills, people getting appointed to conference committees on appropriation bills and not necessarily knowing what that appropriation might be until the very last minute. I don't think that's good government. I really don't. And I don't think it's a partisan issue, frankly. I think that there are Republican rank and file members, Joe, who are more frustrated about this than I am. Yeah. But some people are being held out of this process. And so let's just take the snapshot where we are now. It's Friday evening. We're being told that conference committees aren't going to meet this weekend, that they might come in Sunday night and sign a report. Maybe not. We don't know. These are huge issues at stake. One of them is the teacher pay raise. We know that the House passed a $4,000 teacher pay raise. Rather than adopting the House position as has been the historic posture of the Speaker is suggesting maybe not. But we don't know at this point what the alternative is. Now, that's an issue that affects thousands of Mississippians, and it's very important to every member of that chamber. And so the notion that that would get worked out in secret, not to mention all the other state and agency budgets, which as we sit here right now, mere days from the close of this session, We just don't know. And so that, to me, Joe, is that's a frustrating part of this as a just rank and file citizen watching it.
It is, and it's funny, it reminds me of that old saying, where you stand depends on where you sit. When I was Lieutenant Governor's Chief of Staff, I was fine with the process being secretive, but then the more you get away from it, you're not. Haley Barbour used to say some problems are problems to be managed and not solved. I think this is one of those that, you can try to make it better with more transparency. I think you're always going to have people who are for transparency until they get into the leadership, and then it's not as much of a priority. I don't mean that they're insincere about it, but no, I agree with you. I know that as it gets closer, it just so happens, I think a lot of times this is also the toughest time of the year when things are busiest and people are trying to get their work done. But people need to know enough about what they're voting on and enough time, obviously, to make a decision on it.
Let's talk about the Landowner Protection Act. This is something that I won't say sailed through, but it made it through both sides of the Capitol pretty easily this time. But this is something that, Joe, you recall came up, 15 years ago?
Yeah, and since Brandon doesn't know anything about this issue, I'll speak to that. I'm just playing. I know you're an expert.
I'm punched down on it.
No, that's right. No, look, I was thinking about when this issue came up. I remember sitting with Lieutenant Governor at the time, Amy Tuck, and Governor Haley Barbour in the 2004 and Charlie Ross tort reform package. Mm-hmm. And I remember the discussion at the time was that this particular aspect of it was going to be left out. And there was some talk about kind of seeing how things worked out. Some of the concerns people have, they're talking about now, they were talking about back then, that they would use a wait and see approach and things like that. I think some people, and I know Brandon would probably disagree, but I think some people feel like that the wait and see approach has resulted in determining that we need to make a change, that there's something that needs to be done. I don't think, as a lawyer, nothing's going to be perfect. But, we don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think in this particular case, you can argue both sides, but I think a lot of people feel, they talked about making this change a while back. They didn't make it. They didn't make it several times. And I feel like they believe, from business leaders to people you wouldn't expect, are supporting it, even though I know there's a passionate arguments on both sides.
What changed between then and now?
I think what changed is, again, on my side, from my perspective, I think what changed, Wilson, was at the time they wanted to wait and see whether they thought it was necessary. In other words, I think what some people that are voting in favor of it now and support it now felt like was that 15 years ago, some people felt like maybe it's not necessary. And then they've seen over the last 15 years, because of whatever lawsuits, impact it's had on businesses, et cetera, they feel like a change is necessary. I think what's changed is they've had the benefit of hindsight, which they didn't have at the time it was originally discussed.
Joe, you spoke a moment ago about how sometimes your perspective changes and it changes your perception of things,
Sure.
When you're not as close to something. This is amazing to me, but I'm getting nostalgic for Haley Barbour every time I look at this legislature. And I was one of the ones who was one of his fiercest critics whenever I was in the House.
Right.
But I was just thinking.
If you ever run for something again, I'm going to tell you something. You in a Democrat primary, that clip right there is going to haunt you forever.
Right. Well, I was thinking about it with respect to the budgeting process. I think Haley took us a step closer to this kind of lockstep uniformity, but it was more transparent than this. And when you mentioned, that kind of deliberative way of evaluating when have we gone too far with certain things, I feel like Governor Barbour had a better sense of that than some of the folks over there now. I feel like he was a little bit more restrained on some of these things, and just hearing that story reminds me of that. So I don't know, Wilson, we're at a weird place in history. I'm just feeling nostalgia, and hearing Joe talk about the good old days has me just, in a different
Governor
space.
Bryant's watching. I just want to say I don't agree with what he just said, just for the record.
Let's talk about this constitutional convention resolution. Where did this come from?
Wilson, I think that this has been an issue that's been percolating, as they say, for a while. I think that people who are concerned about balanced budget, lower debt, term limits. We were joking before you came, Brandon. I love the people in the legislature that have been fighting for two-term term limits all 7 terms they've been in the legislature. A lot of times that brings out the sincerity or lack thereof and things. But I think that where this came from was a concern, about those issues. Now, we all know those issues are a lot easier to be concerned about when you're campaigning than when you're governing. It's a lot easier to balance budgets when you don't have to do it or to not run again until you get in there. So, Wilson, to answer your question, I think it came out of a discussion that's been going on for quite some time. The interesting thing about it is, at first glance, it would appear that it's just kind of a more right of center thing. But you've got people like Jeb Bush, people like former Senator Tom Coburn, in addition to people you would think like Rand Paul and Jim DeMint supporting the effort. So I think that alone, from kind of a macro standpoint, would tell you that, I believe there's some opportunity there. The problem, I think, for some people is, Brandon, I don't know how realistic they view that it is because of the multi-year process, because of what all might go into it. Is it a show horse, or is it actually something that might happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to be circumspect about it because it just seems bananas. It seems like a Rand Paul fever dream. I mean, I think that it's fine when you go in there and you say, here are these good government things we're really interested in. But when you throw open the playbook on amending the Constitution and you put that gets some folks really anxious. I mean, women watching the show, they appreciate some of the changes that have been made. It gave them the right to vote.
Chasing the car, you don't know what happened when you catch it.
You just don't know. And so I think it's just a very bizarre process. And the other part of this is the type of economic engineering that Alan West and other proponents of this are suggesting is precisely, Joe, what would level us here in Mississippi. I mean, we benefit from a very favorable exchange rate with federal government on programs like Medicaid, HUD, and other things. We get back a lot of money based on what we put in.
Talking about Mississippi specifically.
Mississippi specifically. And so it's kind of the notion that we would be first in or one of the first in on something like this. It's like, maybe our friends over at the Capitol didn't read the fine print, but this would mess up our budget in ways that I don't think they've considered.
We'll have to leave it there. Brandon, Joe, thank you both as always. We're out of time. Don't forget you can watch this program on our website, mpbonline.org/issue. And we invite you to tune in to At Issue on MPB Think Radio, Monday mornings at 9. Thank you for joining us tonight, and have a good night.